Hello and welcome to Track Changes. And hello, Francisca Curran. How are you doing?
Really well, thanks, Murray. How are you going?
Yeah, I'm pretty good and very excited about today's episode. I suspect you are as well.
100%. I've been looking forward to this episode for quite a while.
Yes, and the reason is this episode features Ralph Regenvanu, who is Vanuatu's climate change minister, also Vanuatu's environment minister, and he's a globally renowned figure for his work in trying to push through action on climate change at a global level. And he's one of the key players in a very significant court decision that was handed down earlier this year.
That's right. He played a key role in ensuring agreement to seek an opinion from the Court of Justice, the ICJ, on climate change obligations of nations. So quite an impressive and inspiring feat.
Yes, and he's now leading work to weave the court's landmark opinion into climate change policy making and decision making across the board, including at the COP30 climate summit in Brazil and through the UN General Assembly. But the focus of this episode is slightly different. Do you want to tell us about it, Francisca?
Sure, Murray. So we're going to be talking to Ralph about the Melanesian Ocean Reserve, which is will be a massive reserve spanning more than 6 million square kilometres of ocean, and encompassing the exclusive economic zones of Vanuatu, the Solomon Islands, Papua New Guinea, and New Caledonia.
It's an amazing initiative, as you'll hear.
Let's go to the chat with Ralph. It starts with Ralph's response when I asked him about his early career and his influences and the people who most inspired him.
So I got into politics in 2008. I came from a background of cultural heritage management, working as director of the National Museum of Vanuatu and the Vanuatu Cultural Centre, and working to safeguard what is essentially in Vanuatu the most important heritage is the intangible cultural heritage, the lived life ways of the people who continue to live in a very close connection with their traditions, because in Vanuatu we still live in ancestral kin groups on ancestral land, mostly indigenous people. So thousands of years of connection, and this system is the resilience in our society, and it provides most of the life's needs come from this relationship with the land and resources, where you get most of your food from gardening, hunting, fishing. People get most of their resources for building their homes and so on from the environment. When we became independent in 1980, Vanuatu as an independent state, we enshrined in our constitution that the indigenous people would be the owners of the land in the way that we had traditionally. This was our rejection of the colonial system that had come in and started to take the land from the people to be used for cattle stations, coconut plantations, that kind of thing. So I think the biggest inspiration, the people who have most inspired me, have been the people who fought for the independence of Vanuatu, including my parents, and wrote the constitution for the new country that really tried to make a balance between having a modern state based in an indigenous reality and trying to create this sort of indigenous constitution, whereas a modern state, the modern state of Vanuatu, would run according to a mix of the traditional customary values and systems and the new introduced Western democratic systems like a judiciary, a parliament, and so on. And I think the greatest achievement in my career has been to get the land laws amended, get the reform that happened in 2014, which was about 6 years after I got into Parliament. So it was a stretch trying to get to the stage where I could be in a position where we could push these reforms and get them passed. And we even passed an amendment to the Constitution to ensure that the stewardship or custodianship of Indigenous land was not subject to determination by Western courts. It had to be determined under customary institutions. And the remainder of my time in politics, while dealing with climate change as the other thing that is greatly undermining our traditional resilience and the future of our society, is the fact that conduct by states and other actors beyond our borders is actually narrowing our options for future development because we're seeing the impacts of climate change come in, which are so detrimental to having a self-determined future. These are the things that occupy me now as I move into, my second decade in politics.
Before we jump into some questions about the Melanesian Ocean Reserve, could you please tell us a bit about what the ocean means to you and to the people of Vanuatu?
Well, in Vanuatu, the ocean is over 95% of our national territory. So the land area of Vanuatu is less than 5% of the total state boundaries of Vanuatu, and over 95% is ocean. Most of us in Vanuatu, I would say the great majority, live close to the ocean. It's something where, for example, for me, I've always been close to the ocean. So even if you don't see it, you feel it, and it's in your being and your understanding of how you interact with the environment, and it's always there. And it feels sometimes very disturbing for me when I've had that chance to travel to, other places in the world where you're in large continents, miles and miles from the sea. It's very disturbing for me to be in that kind of place because I'm not close to the ocean. And the ocean plays an important part in our identity, in our origin stories, how we came to where we currently live. We tell stories of how our ancestors used to trade across the oceans, travel to other places, and we formed family connections with people from other islands, people from other countries now in the Pacific. Before we had these states, we had these connections between the different islands that weren't states at that time. And the ocean continues to be a source of sustenance for us in terms of food, but also, a principal means of getting around. It's a bridge between us, between different communities, between different countries. And also, of course, when we are now entering cyclone season, as I'm speaking to, November. And so it also becomes a source of great destruction also, of course, when we have a massive cyclone. But it's something that is intertwined with our lives, and there is no way we exist without the ocean.
Thanks. So it's really powerful, the interconnections between society, life, culture, day-to-day well-being, and the ocean. How did the idea for the Melanesian Ocean Reserve come about? And could you please tell us a bit about the vision and the goals of this ambitious and important project?
We share Vanuatu, the Solomon Islands, Papua New Guinea, New Caledonia. We share this bedrock of indigenous people having lived in their environments for thousands of years, having very close connections, and actually the management of the environment and the ocean resource having been something that's in our traditional governance. It's in our it's in our societies, and so we've managed and used the ocean. We've been stewards of the ocean and the land for millennia, and that connection exists in all these countries because we have the same. We are part of what's called the Melanesian sub-region of the Pacific. Melanesian people, meaning very roughly, loosely, the Black Islands, black people from these countries. And so we have this connection where we all have systems of managing our resources in the ocean. We have traditionally always traveled between each other and traded. So, for example, the people in the southern part of Vanuatu, in the province of Tafea, have traditional trading relations with the Loyalty Islands province of New Caledonia, and they actually have family ties. They have trade in specific things. For example, pigs come from Vanuatu, and then yams come from Loyalty Islands back to Vanuatu, back to the southern province. And then we have that in the northern part of Vanuatu as well, the relations between the Temutu province, which is the southernmost province of the Solomon Islands, which adjoins Torba province, which is our northern province. We have these connections there too, trading, similar ways of looking and understanding the ocean. And so the idea of actually joining up these places, in effect removing the national boundaries, is in fact a reality that was there before colonialism, right? So we are simply trying to remove those colonial boundaries that were drawn across the ocean between us that basically negate these long-standing, centuries-old connections that we have. And so the idea has been there for many decades. The idea that we will overcome these colonial divides to reassert our connectivity within the ocean beyond these Western state boundaries. And so there's been ideas like the Melanesian corridor, which came out of the Melanesian spearhead group, this idea that we would create this corridor between all the way from Papua New Guinea through the ocean, through the Solomon Islands group, through the Vanuatu Islands group, and down into New Caledonia. That's been there. We've had other conceptualizations. So it was in Colombia in last year, in 2024, that we met at the United Nations Environment Conference, the Biodiversity Conference that was held in Colombia. And we were there with the Minister of Environment from the Solomon Islands, Trevor, my colleague Trevor, and I was there, and we were there with our officials from the Departments of Environment. And then we started talking about taking this idea forward, the idea that, because if you recall way back in, I think it was 2022, the Montreal Kunming Protocol that came out of the United Nations Biodiversity Conference held in Montreal, which set this global target of 30% of our national territory to be protected by 2030. So this idea of 30 by 30. And this is one of the objectives all countries have signed up to and is expected of them. And so in Colombia, we talked about this and we said, look, we can do this, but we can do it on a regional scale, because a lot of these areas that are available for us to protect, and we want to protect them, actually already are protected by the people living on either side of borders. And a lot of these areas are on our borders because we are all adjoined, we're an island chain that goes all the way from Papua New Guinea down to New Caledonia. And so while we're doing it nationally, which is our imperative under the agreement, the Montreal Protocol that we agreed upon, how about we also establish this linked up area beyond national jurisdictions that encompass areas that go across borders and include those as well. And so that's where the idea originated. And that was the vision for it. And basically the goals of it are to empower the indigenous people, including the clans that live in these areas, but also the provincial governments and the national governments of these countries, so that they can continue this stewardship and connectivity with the ocean that's existed for millennia and can be revitalized through supporting the provincial governments and the communities to go back into the ocean. Because what's happened with colonialism is a lot of the time we've retreated from the ocean. We've actually had colonial governments that have come and stopped inter-island trading. Particularly, one of the motivations in Vanuatu was the colonial government stopped inter-island trading so that people would be forced to use the colonial boats and pay them to connect to other islands. And so we largely lost our inter-island canoe-making tradition or sailing tradition. And so a lot of this is trying to revitalize these things, revitalize these routes, trade routes between our countries, and revitalize stewardship and protection of the ocean across borders between different states of our countries. And so those are the basic vision and goals of the Melanesian Ocean Reserve.
So basically it builds on efforts made more recently for all these different nations, but predominantly it reestablishes those pre-colonial connections between these nations that have always had ocean stewardship and protection at heart.
Yes, we are trying to reassert these principles of stewardship and actual implementation of the stewardship that we have been doing, but it has been, of course, threatened by globalization, by climate change. And so we're trying to reassert it and put it back at the front of our agenda. And the governments involved primarily right now, it's Solomons and Vanuatu. We are the ones who met in Colombia, but we have since met with our colleagues in New Caledonia, which of course is still a French colony, but they have a marine park that's been established, which encompasses their entire EEZ, over 1 million square kilometers. And they already have many of these protections that we want to bring in for the rest of the countries. And we've also met with our colleagues from Papua New Guinea, and they are the countries that will be involved in initially: Papua New Guinea, Solomons, Vanuatu, and New Caledonia. And it does build upon a lot of the existing protections we have in place. For example, in Vanuatu, we have 28 kilometers out from the outer perimeters of our outer islands, and including the entire inland sea is already restricted to industrial fishing. No industrial fishing is allowed in that area. So that's already a legal protection that's in place. That also exists in the Solomon Islands. There are legally protected areas where industrial fishing can't happen. As I said, in New Caledonia, the entire EZ, industrial fishing is restricted, and also any mineral exploration or exploitation is already banned by legislation. And so we are trying to make these protections in the law of the states applicable across a number of states, so that we can all say that this is in fact the implementation of the Melanesian Ocean Reserve.
And the reserve will partly overlap the Coral Triangle. How will it build on existing protections and initiatives in place to protect the Coral Triangle?
I think the Melanesian Ocean Reserve will complement and supplement the Coral Triangle, because the Coral Triangle is largely at the northern part of the area that the reserve is wanting to cover. And so basically it will build out and expand the existing protected area of the Coral Triangle and actually make it go further south into New Caledonia and then out. Hopefully, in the future, we hope to also include Fiji and the high seas pockets between Fiji, Solomons and Vanuatu into this much larger protected area that extends all the way from actually Southeast Asia, where the Coral Triangle also works in, all the way out into the Pacific, into the Western Pacific.
And what will be some of the unique features of the project when it comes to fruition? I know you've already touched on this a bit in the purpose, but I also know I've looked a bit at the 4 programmatic paddles. Or is there something else you'd like to tell us about unique features of the project?
I think one of the unique features of the Melanesian Ocean Reserve is the foregrounding of Indigenous stewardship, knowledge, and the people who are the ones who are doing the stewardship. And so very much we want to be able to support those communities. And they are communities, there's smaller communities on the islands all through this area of the Melanesian Ocean Reserve, through Papua New Guinea, Solomons, Vanuatu, New Caledonia. There are communities that are doing this stewardship. And so we want to be able to support them as one of the main features of the Melanesian Ocean Reserve, so that they can continue to practice this stewardship, that we can basically insulate them from pressures of globalization, of having to make money to support themselves from the marine resources. We want to be able to put them in the best position they can be to continue this stewardship and to build upon it and to re-establish these connections that have been there before. And so the governments and provincial governments will be the ones who need to pass the legislative frameworks, the policy frameworks, to empower the communities to continue this stewardship. So really the focus is on the Indigenous peoples who have been managing these areas for millennia.
Coming up, Ralph talks about the governance structure for the Melanesian Ocean Reserve, the activities that will and won't be allowed in the reserve, and the challenges that an initiative of this scale has to overcome. And just before we go back to the chat, here's a couple of ocean facts. The ocean has absorbed about 90% of the heat generated by the pollution that causes climate change and climate disruption. Marine heat waves have doubled in frequency and have become longer lasting, more intensive and extensive. And in Australia, for example, these heat waves are implicated in events like the toxic algal bloom off the South Australian coast and even the mass salmon deaths in Tasmania earlier this year. The 1.1 degrees of warming that we've already had has resulted in about 60% of the world's marine ecosystems being degraded or used unsustainably, according to the UN. And the UN also says that warming of 1.5 degrees threatens to destroy 70% or as much as 90% of coral reefs, while a 2-degree increase means a nearly 100% loss of coral, a point of no return that we must avoid.
These are really scary facts, really scary numbers as well. And unfortunately, the problem is that for too long, most of the world, most governments have acted as if the ocean is too big to fail. We've assumed that we can fish at industrial scales and we'll always have more fish. And we've assumed we can put pollution into the ocean and it'll just go away and not come back and won't build up, and that we can live without consequences of using it as a dumping ground. But the governments and communities involved in the Melanesian Ocean Reserve have always known how to look after the oceans in ways most of us aren't currently doing. And what they're doing with the Melanesian Ocean Reserve and how they're going about it is an expression of that knowledge and is something we can all learn from. Okay, back to the chat with Ralph. Can you tell us a bit about the governance structures for the reserve and how that will work?
So for each of the countries in Melanesian Ocean Reserve, we need to have our own marine spatial plans in place to enable this larger idea of the Melanesian Ocean Reserve to basically fit on top of it. We have the areas we have already reserved. In Vanuatu, for example, we have the foreshore to the edge of the outer reef plus 100 meters as the area that is under the jurisdiction of customary law. So under the jurisdiction of the chiefs and village councils of the communities that live along the shoreline. And then we have the jurisdiction to 28 kilometers that I was talking about, which is national government. And then we have also out to the perimeter of the exclusive economic zone, 200 kilometers, the exclusive economic zone, which is also managed by the government. So we need to assign these areas of jurisdiction and then allow for this working together between the indigenous communities and the government and the provincial governments, who are the governance authorities in this space we're talking about, putting in place the mechanisms whereby we can have this cooperation, this working together to ensure that the areas that we put aside in the high seas, not the high seas, sorry, the area beyond up to 200 kilometers out, which is in fact beyond the normal range of our local communities in terms of accessing resources. They used to travel there through sailing canoes to go to different islands that are now not part of Vanuatu. But in terms of providing these oceanway accesses, this is something that we need to work together. We need to map out the marine spatial plans and then overlap them with the Melanesian Ocean Reserve area of, I suppose you could say, identification, because we have a number of layers of jurisdiction over which, in the end, we will achieve the objectives of the Melanesian Ocean Reserve and, of course, our national plan, which is 30 by 30. 30% of the marine space are protected by 2030. But with the overlapping of the Melanesian Ocean Reserve and areas between countries, which we both agree to protect, we can actually increase that figure beyond that by using this interstate cooperation that we're developing through the Melanesian Ocean Reserve initiative.
That scale is so exciting, and the way it's sort of built up in these different zones and areas. And my next question is around how those different areas, how that translates to what activities will be allowed in different zones and how this works, what people can expect.
So essentially, there are basically two restrictions that we want the Melanesian Ocean Reserve to apply. One is no industrial fishing. And so this refers to the large vessels that we license, particularly Vanuatu and Solomons and Papua New Guinea. We have a regime where we license foreign fishing vessels, some of our own flagged fleet, but operated by people outside, not nationals. So we have these, basically the tuna fishing fleets that are registered to Vanuatu, to Solomons, to Papua New Guinea, that fish for tuna in the outer areas of our EEZs, beyond the 28-kilometer restricted zone around the islands. We want industrial fishing to be restricted, to not be allowed in the area of the Melanesian Ocean Reserve. That's one. And the second restriction is deep sea mineral extraction, which is now a looming threat in the Pacific. So basically, no industrial fishing and no deep sea mineral extraction will be the two key characteristics of the Melanesian Ocean Reserve in terms of protection. Allowing domestic fishing, that is already something that we've agreed that we want to do. We want to allow this traditional indigenous way we've always maintained and sustained our communities and sustainably managed the ocean. So it's a no-loss principle for indigenous fishing, indigenous use of, domestic use of these areas. But we do want to restrict those two activities I talked about, those large-scale industrial harmful activities to the environment. And so for New Caledonia, for example, that is the entire EEZ. They have really restricted those two activities in the entire EEZ, which is the largest EEZ of all our countries, all our 4 countries put together. In Vanuatu, we are engaging in a national discussion now as to what areas, how much can we restrict? We already have the 28 kilometers either side, plus the internal waters already restricted to both activities. We need to discuss whether we can extend that. And the same thing for Solomons and the same thing for Papua New Guinea. And but it was good to hear at Nice, at the UN Oceans Conference in Nice earlier this year, both the Prime Ministers of Solomons and Papua New Guinea declaring that they will not allow deep sea mineral extraction in their EEZs. So that is already one step forward towards achieving this restriction on those two activities.
So what are some of the challenges associated with launching an initiative of this scale, and how are you working to overcome them?
There's a lot of challenges. One of them is that, probably the main one, is that we have a number of champions in these different countries who wanting to push it, but it's not by far the whole governments, right? So only in the Solomon Islands have we got a cabinet decision to support the Melanesian Ocean Reserve. In Vanuatu, cabinet is considering it. It's been brought to cabinet. It's now with the Maritime Delimitation Committee, who have concerns about how it'll affect our negotiations on our boundaries. I know in New Caledonia, while they are the most advanced in terms of actually implementing the objectives of the Melanesian Ocean Reserve, they are also going through some political instability because of what's been happening in that territory over the last couple of years, and what's happening in France with the instability of the government there, actually having a government that is stable enough to make a decision. So those are the kind of macro level challenges we face. In terms of the local communities, they're pretty much on board because we've already been doing consultations for our marine spatial plan. I know in Solomons they've done the same, and communities have expressed a desire to have this sort of protection of their stewardship, protection of their access, protection of the fact that they are the ones who've been managing this and they want to continue to manage it, and they need assistance in terms of capacity building, in terms of providing financial support so that they can continue to feel empowered to focus on sustainable management of the resource. So we need to, basically we're working more at national government level now to try and get this over the line in terms of nations. But I know that, for example, at the Solomon Islands Pacific Island Forum Leaders Summit in August this year, the Prime Minister of Solomons announced the framework we're going to be using for coordination across the 4 countries. And also at that meeting was an occasion for the president of Torba province, our most northern province, and Temutu province, the most southern province of Solomons, who share a border. They in fact announced that they would be creating a massive marine protected area that crosses the boundaries. So they're already, through that announcement at provincial level, they are working to implement the objectives of the Melanesian Ocean Reserve at that level. So it's trying to get buy-in those that haven't been fully convinced yet in our national governments and provincial governments. It seems that the provincial governments are already on board. We need to make sure that we can balance the various interests. We have the fishing interest, for example, which is one of the major revenue sources for our countries, is tuna fisheries. Tourism, we have, there is still interest in mineral extraction. This is something that's hanging around. We need to make sure we balance everything and try and come up with basically a boundary we can all agree on in Vanuatu, in Solomons, in Papua New Guinea, to make sure that this becomes the area of the Melanesian Ocean Reserve. And then we can also talk about extending out to the limits of our EEZ with other total management sort of objectives to make sure that we're seeing our whole EEZs as some sort of a managed area with some criteria as to what level of protection is being afforded in the entire EEZs.
Listening to your answer, it's easy to appreciate not only are you operating at a giant, massive scale, but also across different scales, so many different scales that all require different approaches and challenges. And like you've said, all have different interests. On the reserve's website, the FAQ page has a Q&A stating, how will the Melanesian Ocean Reserve succeed where other approaches have not? Could you talk us through that point a bit and about sort of learning from other experiences and what failures elsewhere you might be referring to?
One thing that doesn't seem to have worked very well is a state declaring that this area in the ocean is a protected area, like a unilateral decision from the government. This is something we're trying to avoid. It doesn't work in our context where the communities have the legal jurisdiction of a large area of the marine resource, the marine areas, and also where we have countries built on constitutional recognition of indigenous community custodianship and stewardship of the land and the resources. And so the approach that I was speaking of previously, where we're trying to prioritize empowering our coastal communities to engage in stewardship, to engage in revitalizing the traditional trade routes, the traditional voyaging connections, and also to recognize the fact that these borders that were put in when we became independent are in fact, and they were actually put in by the colonial powers before we became independent, should not prevent us from exercising these traditional imperatives that have always been there. And so that's something for example, for national governments to ease any national legislation around border crossing, so to speak. So making sure that these local level priorities by the communities are reflected both at provincial level and national level in the legislation we have in place, in the policies we have in place, is the thing that we think will make the Melanesian Ocean Reserve succeed, where other initiatives that aim to protect without involvement of the community have failed.
One of the central elements to the reserve is also to know the ocean through modern science and customary knowledge. Could you please expand on that and explain what that involves? And also, is that approach something that should be applied more widely to efforts to fight climate change and protect nature?
It's widely recognized now that Indigenous knowledge plays a huge part in the successful stewardship of environmental resources. And this was really something that the world, the international community recognized in the Kunming-Montreal Protocol that came out of the CBD COP back in 2022 in Montreal. For the first time, all states of the world recognized that the only places that have been really effectively protected in terms of maintaining high biodiversity values in the world are those areas that have been under the stewardship of Indigenous peoples. And the same can be said for the area we're talking about in Melanesia. I mean, it's a biodiversity hotspot, and it has been managed for hundreds of years by Indigenous peoples, no one else, not the state, not other entities. And so Indigenous knowledge is crucial, but of course, modern science is also crucial. And we need to bring that in so that we can create a co-management model where we use both. The Indigenous peoples who manage can be given additional science and knowledge to help them better understand and implement management of these resources. And a good example of how we could do this was just in the last month, we've had the National Geographic vessel, Pristine Oceans, the vessel called the Argo, has been here doing deep dives, literal deep dives. They've got a submersible vessel. They also have a lot of scuba gear. They can go down, and they're doing transects of the reef in different parts of Vanuatu, finding out what's right down at the bottom using the submersible and video cameras. And this now has been brought to us. And I know, for example, in the northernmost province of Vanuatu, the provincial government will be taking these films that were shot at the bottom of the ocean in that area around to the communities and showing them, because they can't go down there, right? So showing them what's there, what's happening at the different levels of the reef going down. This data will now be taken by the team from Pristine Seas, which is the international organization working with National Geographic and the government. And they'll be analyzed. And in 1 year's time, it will be brought back to Vanuatu as reports, as a film made in the local pidgin. So it's aimed at local audiences to show them what is down here and how does decisions made by the stewards actually help maintain the biodiversity at the bottom of the ocean, for example. And what the research mission found, interestingly, was that where you have these strong traditional protection mechanisms in place, you can see the result in terms of the increase in biodiversity on the reef, on the deep sea. As this is a good example of how we can bring modern science and customary knowledge together and reinforce each other.
That is such a good example and a really exciting sort of innovation. Are we happy to go a little bit longer, Ralph? We've just got a few more questions that Murray would ask.
Thanks so much, Ralph. This proposal was made public at this year's UN Ocean Conference in France in June, I think. And as we record this chat, the UN Climate COP is about to take place in Brazil. And then next year's might well be an Australia Pacific Climate COP. Could you talk about the connection between fighting climate change and ocean protection? And what do this year's and next year's COP need to achieve to protect our ocean environment?
So what we're seeing is that our oceans, the temperature of our oceans is increasing. This is a result of climate change, directly related to greenhouse gas emissions. And this increasing temperature of the ocean is resulting in damage to coral. I've actually seen a scientific report just come out in the last couple of months, which says we've reached the tipping point for coral. The prediction is in the next few decades there will be no coral left, which is very alarming for people like us who depend on the coral for our sustenance and for our ocean health. We're also seeing sea level rise because of the heating of the ocean due to greenhouse gas emissions. We're also seeing increasing extreme weather events, particularly tropical cyclones, which draw upon the warm water to build themselves, like we saw in the tragedy just occurring in Jamaica just last week.
Yes.
So what we need to protect our ocean, the UNFCCC COP, what we're trying to achieve there is a rapid phase out of fossil fuels, right? As the main contributor to climate change. 86% of global greenhouse gas emissions come from fossil fuel use. And so this is clearly the main thing we need to do, is a rapid, sustained phase out of fossil fuels. And that's what the Pacific Island countries, the Pacific small island developing states, we always go to COP to try and push this. We haven't got very far. We've achieved some, but nowhere near what we need to, allow us to see a possible reverse in climate change in decades to come. So that's what we need, really, the greenhouse gas emission rapid phase out. But in terms of what we're doing locally, the best way to make our oceans resilient to climate change is to ensure the best protection possible, so that we reduce our own human pressure in terms of gleaning the reef or fishing off the reef. We try to put areas aside so they can replenish themselves and surrounding areas, create no-take zones, find a way to, as much as possible, build resilience of our marine environment, continue to push for this phase out of fossil fuels. We managed to get this year at the International Court of Justice in July an advisory opinion saying it's a legal obligation of states to phase out fossil fuels, and that states must take all necessary measures to do so. And so we're going into the coming COP with this extra, tool under our arms, which is this recent ICJ advisory opinion, to hope to be able to convince the high-emitting states who continue to, go down this path of fossil fuel extraction and new production and use to, take the measures that science tells us we need to take to stop global warming.
It has been inspiring to see the role of Pacific Island nations in securing that advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice, and also their involvement in the push for a non-fossil fuel treaty initiative. Those have both been incredibly impressive things. Can I ask you, with the Melanesian Ocean Reserve, what are the next steps and what's the timeline for launching this initiative?
So we announced the Melanesian Ocean Reserve initiative in Nice in June. We are hoping that by June next year, we will have announced both the implementation mechanism, which is some sort of a platform across the countries to administer the program going forward, but also the buy-in of the states, like officially at cabinet level: Papua New Guinea, Solomons, New Caledonia. Solomons has done it, Papua New Guinea, Vanuatu, New Caledonia. 3 of the countries that we want cabinet level endorsement. Solomons has already got that across the line. We need to see that happening before June next year. The announcement of the platform that we're going to use for collaboration. There's going to be a number of meetings also that are happening now into next year to refine the concept, the implementation package, what particular activities we're going to undertake. But I'm very much hoping that by June next year, we can launch actually something that is officially agreed upon by all countries. And there is a implementation platform in place, and we're actually starting to roll out certain activities. We are actually already rolling out activities as part of the Melanesian Ocean Reserve, and one was the meeting and announcement by the president of Torba province and the premier of Vanuatu province, where they announced this cross-boundary marine protected area, one of the largest in both our countries. And so that was facilitated by the Melanesian Ocean Reserve initiative.
It's going to be very exciting to see it unfold. Just 2 more questions. Firstly, as well as being a politician, you're an anthropologist and an artist. How do those strands of your life help to shape your thinking with regard to the Melanesian Ocean Reserve initiative and to your other work?
Yes, well, I haven't done art in a good many years. I don't have the time anymore with my other hats. But my anthropology training has been crucial throughout my life, throughout my career, because I'm living in this context of a Western state-derived, Western-derived forms, all our development that's happening now. I'm here working in an office, sitting on a computer, but in an environment where we have traditional governance, we have customary values, we have our kinship relations, and so on. So we live in 2 worlds, basically. And that anthropology training has been critical to be able to give me a better analysis of this moving forward, and particularly when it came to the land reform, as I was talking about earlier, trying to create legislation that actually creates a space for the operation of customary law. And that's also one of the very crucial things about the Melanesian Ocean Reserve will be the same. How do states create legislative frameworks and policy frameworks that give the space for traditional customary governance to work? Because throughout Melanesia, we have very many cultures. We literally have hundreds of different language groups and culture groups throughout Papua New Guinea, Solomons and Vanuatu. Distinct languages is recognized as one of the most linguistically and culturally diverse areas of the world. And so we need to provide for how this is going to operate. We can't actually legislate a law in a particular community because their law will be different to the next one's. But the law has to actually allow for customary law to operate according to what it is in that particular place at that particular time. And so these kind of insights, having that anthropology training really helps to be able to work along those kind of lines. And I think the Melanesian Ocean Reserve itself it builds on our indigenous constitutions that we have in the Solomons, in Vanuatu, in Papua New Guinea, where we did say customary law continues to operate as part of the laws of these countries. And we also did say in our constitutions, all our constitutions, that land and the resources belongs to the indigenous tribes according to customary law. And so we will continue to negotiate this space where it's quite unique maybe in the world, where we have these states with a very high level of indigenous people. I would say over 90% of our population is indigenous. So we have indigenous people actually in government. They are the politicians, they are the policymakers, they are the bureaucrats. And so trying to maintain that dynamic of operating in these two distinct realms and bringing them together in how we move forward in terms of our vision for development and actually the reality of how we develop our countries.
That's a great answer. Thanks so much. Just one more question. It's a standard question for all guests. What fact or insight do you wish was more widely known because it would help us to move faster to a cleaner, greener, better world?
I think the one insight, if I had to give just one, would be that Indigenous people are the best custodians of the natural environment. And this has been proven through science. As I said earlier, when the Kunming-Montreal Protocol was decided upon at the 2022 Convention on Biological Diversity Conference of the Parties, it recognized for the first time this was a fact. And so governments need to provide that space and cede control over these areas to Indigenous peoples as a way to manage them better. And I think this is something that in countries that have Indigenous populations, which is a large number of countries. In the Pacific, it's all countries. Of course, Australia, New Zealand, and the US, what we call the settler colonies. It's ceding control of large areas of land and marine resources to Indigenous people to manage is one of the best interventions we can do. And this happens in Australia, for example. I know there's large areas under Indigenous control, but it's something that we should not fear, but we should embrace. And more needs to be done in achieving this. And that's probably the greatest insight I can give coming from this background of Melanesian Ocean Reserve. Also in terms of what we need to address climate change moving forward, which is the biggest threat to the Pacific and to the world, of course, is recognizing this and giving priority and place so that Indigenous peoples, local communities can be really involved in the stewardship of the resources we have, the environment we have, and also assisting us with this transition we need away from a fossil fuel dependent society towards something that's much more sustainable.
Thanks so much, Ralph. That's a very powerful answer, and it's been a wonderful chat. We really appreciate your time. Thanks so much, and all the best.
Thank you so much, Ralph. We really appreciate your time. It's so inspiring, and I'm sure it'll be very inspiring for our listeners as well.
Okay, thank you. Good.
I really enjoyed the way Ralph talked about Vanuatu's cultural heritage through the lens of the ocean, and I was just amazed by the scale of this initiative.
Yeah, the scale really struck me too. It's not just working with communities and leaders at a community level, but also the government, intergovernmental, and industry with really far-reaching impacts and a great number of stakeholders involved, which is really impressive and inspiring.
It is, isn't it? Because you have to bring together so many diverse interests, so many diverse stakeholders, and land them on the same page. And that's no mean feat. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, please rate it and share it with friends and colleagues. See you next time.
See you next time.